All right, let's begin. Welcome everyone to Alumni Relations and Diverse Populations, Reframing Engagement Towards Equity and Inclusion. I'm your host, Jay Dillon, Executive Director of Alumni Relations at the University of California, Berkeley. We are happy to have you here with us for this, our fifth coffee chat of the Alumni Engagement Community of Practice. A little bit more on that later. Before we begin, I want to call your attention to the slide on your screen with some tips and best practices for experiencing the webinar today. Specifically, we'd like you to submit and upvote questions using that Q&A box. It's right down at the bottom of your screen. Let's reserve the chat for positive comments and sharing resources with one another. Now, neither the Q&A nor the chat are anonymous. And the reason is we want to share out with you afterwards both the questions that came in, responses, and the chat text. So please be on your best behavior. All right, we'll leave this slide up for a few minutes as others join the webinar. We are very glad to have you with us to talk about all things equity and inclusion in the alumni engagement space. With me today is a panel of scholar practitioners. They are alumni relations pros, and they are also deeply embedded with the social science research and understanding how alumni engagement is actually accomplished and how the research is often critical of or offers new solutions to some of the challenges that we all face. So this will be our focus today: research and evidence-based approaches to meaningful engagement with the Black, Indigenous, and people of color that make up our alumni communities. Our hope is to be as informal and as in-depth as possible as we talk about the challenges facing advancement now and into the future. Thank you everyone who submitted questions as a part of the registration process. We had over 150 questions come in, just amazing, thank you. Now your questions we bucketed into three themes for today. First, social science research and diverse engagement. Then we'll talk about the importance of language, a scary thing for a lot of people, but we hope to set those fears aside today. And approach, co-creating and working with alumni groups. We'll speak to that. Then we will get to your questions as quickly as we can at about the half hour. And then finally, at the end of our program, we've invited back some of our speakers from previous webinars to ask them what have they learned in these last few months. Simply put, we want to learn a lot, have fun, and learn a lot. So let's begin. I'll let each of my colleagues introduce themselves in response to our first question. Now, there are some best practice resources out there for folks who are interested in learning more about engaging with alumni of color, specifically the design of programs. But what does the social science research reveal about how we approach this work? And I'll turn first to you, AP.
Thank you, Jay. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for watching and supporting this webinar. As Jay said, my name is A. Philanda. I go by AP Moore. I use he, him, and his pronouns. I'm the Assistant Director of Alumni Engagement at the University of Oregon Alumni Association, and I work specifically with all identity-based alumni constituencies. So that's all of our special interest, professional, and all of our multicultural or ethnic groups. And at the university, it's my goal to raise public awareness around these affinity groups, to grow their membership, to promote their activities, as well as some assistance with development for fundraising opportunities. I think when we talk about this specifically from a social science standpoint, I look at this from three specific areas: with collection, and particularly collection of data, communication, and then connection, and what does that look like for students or alumni when they're students. And so for the collection piece, we know that our data is really what makes us who we are. And if the data isn't as good as what it can be in this particular space, we just cannot engage those individuals in a way that's going to be beneficial. And so figuring out different ways to ensure that data is up to date accurately, as well as providing opportunities to do listening sessions to understand and better know those different alumni groups. And then in terms of communication, which we will talk a little bit more about in our second question, is understanding the dynamic of changing the communication to the specific audience that you are talking to. And why that is important from a social science standpoint is we know that we send out emails daily and monthly, and the open rates of those emails are different depending on which institution you're at. However, if you're only sending the same communication to all of the constituent groups as a whole, then are you actually targeting those and engaging the group that you want to actually get that information? And then lastly, having a tie back to the campus is, I think, the crucial part of the science. Is we know that if a student was engaged with extracurricular activities on campus, there's a greater chance that they're going to also then be engaged as alumni. Now, when you talk about that from a BIPOC perspective, now we're not only we talk about are those individuals connected to those student groups on campus, but also then how are they connected back to the university? And if they, for chance, had a different or bad experience, and not because they weren't extracurricular, they didn't have extracurricular activities, but they didn't have a great connection to campus, then how do we build that community and that connection back? And the way that we can do that is through our online communities, which we have all kind of been working through in this COVID and Zoom environment. And so building online communities for those individuals to connect with one another would allow for optimal opportunity to then connect back to the university. And so those are the three areas that I want to talk about specifically as we kind of go through the rest of the day. But those all fall under this three-pronged approach to commitment, and the commitment from the university to diversity. It's not something that we can just talk about from a research standpoint, but are we committed to doing the diverse engagement that we say we are? And if we are, those are the three areas that I think can move us and move that needle to actually doing that work.
Thank you, AP. I think very well said. I hope everyone was noting those top three from you. You know, it's no surprise that the right message in the right vehicle from the right messenger will really resonate with different alumni communities, and particularly the BIPOC community. That's the Black, Indigenous, and people of color community. Let me go ahead and turn to you, Meghan, with a quick introduction and your thoughts about the social science research in this area.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jay. Hi, everyone. I'm so honored to share this virtual space with so many participants. My name is Meghan Montelibano Gorman, she, her, and I'm the Alumni Engagement Coordinator at the University of Denver. So as a nod to my Jesuit education, I believe in intentional programming, making sure we understand the why, who, how, etc. And this strategy applies to all constituents, not just alumni of color, but there is some nuance as a programmer to be successful in this work. So bringing it back to the research, I like to apply Michael Bumbry's model of identity-based motivation theory as a framework to understand the complex and wonderful identities alumni of color bring to our work. So this model breaks it down into three parts. The first is identity salience with race and ethnicity and socioeconomic status. The second is affinity to the student and alumni experience. And the third is one's concept of philanthropy. And that includes both monetary and non-monetary forms of support. So I like this model because it gives us as practitioners kind of a guide for qualification visits. It helps me understand an alum's motivation and also recognizes that just because someone belongs to a group does not mean they identify with that group, right? There's variance and personal connection to all of those items I just listed. And it's so important to disaggregate BIPOC folks in this work. Related to IBM is the importance of uncentering yourself when it comes to the why, how, and who of programming. This is not about you. This is about the alumni of color you serve who bring experiences, cultural understandings, joy, and trauma trauma that you may not understand, and that's okay. I particularly like IBM since it accounts for how multiple identities, intersectionality influence decision making decisions based on situational context. So as administrators for institutions that more than likely minoritizes BIPOC folk, your situational context influences how and if an alum engages. So it's really important to authentically build trust and recognize your position, your power, and your privilege when working with alumni of color.
Thank you, Megan. Authenticity is so very important, both to our conversation today and what we are talking about. Just wanted to highlight that AP has added his 3 things in the chat. I'm sure Megan will do the same. It seems like everyone's got a plan. So all of you who are tuning in today, you're in for a treat. I also want to call out my colleague from UCLA, Patricia, who put in the chat a nice correction to what I said earlier. When we talk about BIPOC, we are talking about communities and not a single community. Let's not homogenize that. Thank you, Patricia. Okay, keeping this question going, social science research, what does it reveal? Chase, what do you have to share?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here. I'm so excited and honored to share this space. And Megan's introduction and Jay's comment, and I love what you said, Patricia, is really a great segue into my introduction. Chase McNamee, he, him, his pronouns, really important to mention pronouns there. And I also just want to say I'm honored to be in this space because I identify as a white, straight, cis male. And that is what it is. There's no guilt attached to that. It's more about being aware of how I show up in a space. And that is that authenticity piece that Jay was saying. And something that I've epically failed at times. I come from a small rural town on a farm and ranch in Wyoming. And I always was the first to speak up. I was always very outspoken, and I show up big in a space. And that's always been my personality. But there's been so many folks who have been willing to sit with me and talk with me and help me learn more about my identities and my privileges and how I kind of interact in the world. And so I think that's just important to kind of start out to say it's okay to fail, but it's also something that you want to try to learn and maybe unlearn some behaviors as you're going along, which is something that I try to do. And I'm lucky to have stumbled into the field of advancement. I wanted to be in higher education. I come from mental health counseling background and a history background. But I realized I had a passion for this work. But as I was working in jobs, and I graduated from the University of Wyoming, and go Pokes, I love my alma mater, I had questions about this field because I thought there's more to this. I'm seeing such awesome engagement, seeing scholarships and games and all of these different things going on, but I wanted to learn more. And so I'm very fortunate to have connected with Professor Noah Dresner, who is such a phenomenal human being and a faculty member at Teachers College, Columbia University. And he's one of the foremost scholars on identity-based philanthropy and philanthropy in higher education. And I started studying with him, and I realized that there's different lenses that you can study philanthropy from. And so a lot of the work that's been done has been so amazing, but it's been focused on things like we were talking about, this homogenous idea of community. You're part of an institution. You're from your alma mater. You give this much because you might have this much wealth, these sorts of things. But there's different lenses that you can kind of look through, and these different theories that we'll talk about that give us an idea to how to be more intentional with engaging with different communities, particularly BIPOC communities. And part of that work is kind of taking a step back and really looking at who we are in our identities as practitioners, as alums, as donors, and these different things. And how do we inject new ideas into our practice? So rather than this homogenous idea of giving scores and engagement scores and these things, how do we bring in social sciences research to say, are there critical questions that we need to ask? Are there theories that highlight race, that highlight inequity, that highlight strength-based models for alumni of color and BIPOC alumni? And so that's something that I really wanted to focus on, and that's where my research lands. I'm super excited. I'm a doctoral candidate at Teachers College now. And I'm studying that just as the field of higher education is rooted in a white, older male perspective, often straight male perspective, so is the history of advancement. And again, that's not to cast blame. It's not to say that those gifts aren't important and haven't made a huge impact, gifts of time, treasure, and talent. But it is the history that we have to come to terms with, that all of our lenses come from that. And so my research lands from an org learning perspective, a systems perspective, and an org culture perspective to really start to think about how we can inject these ideas from research around centering race, around what language that we use, around how people can feel a sense of belonging, our prejudices and biases that show up. And so that's where I think we can learn a lot from the social sciences research, is really kind of picking up that lens and looking at it from a different angle and really asking questions about who's attending, who's not, who's giving and who's not. And so I'm super excited to be in this space. And again, really, really honored. And I'm super excited to hear what other folks have to say.
Thank you, Chase. Well, if we could all make a commitment here, when Chase publishes his dissertation, we are going to blow it up. We are going to download that thing and make it the top downloaded dissertation of maybe 2021. Where are you on track there, Chase?
Oh, I'm going to say 2022. Hang with me, folks.
Okay.
Hang with me.
Well, thank you, Chase, for positioning yourself in the space. That really resonates with me. So let me go now to Edward at Auburn. Edward, social science research has so much to do with the way we approach this work, but what perspective can you share with us about what you read and what you do there?
Absolutely. Well, I'm Edward Reynolds. I serve as the Corporate and Foundation Relations Officer at the Harvard College of Business, located at Auburn University, so War Eagle. I will echo my colleagues here. I'm excited to join you all. I'm very thrilled and honored to be a part of this panel of phenomenal practitioners, researchers in the field. So I just wanted to start off with that introduction. I think as we think about the ways in which we produce and execute alumni engagement programs, we also have to take a step back and look at the internal work that's happening within our organizations. So you will hear me throughout the day kind of take the conversation from that lens, the leadership perspective, and how we create these internal cultures, how we are cognizant always about the climate within our cultures, and how that bears out into our recruitment, retention practices of professionals in advancement and alumni relations. The leadership perspective, the importance of leaders who advocate for inclusive organizations, who have authentic appreciation for the programming that we're talking about today and the execution of that programming. I think authentic engagement, we'll hear that a number of times today, is extremely important. Our constituents, they will recognize if we are just providing lip service. And so I think we need to be aware of that. I also want to say, when you hear me talk about leadership and leaders, I think we are all leaders in our capacities, our varying capacities, from the folks who have the official leadership titles and who have the power and influence throughout the enterprise. So every professional in this field, we should all consider ourselves leaders in this work and be thoughtful and mindful. So I wanted to make that caveat there. One place that I've found some extremely helpful information, I think, for leaders, the Equity in the Center organization. It's a national organization that helps social science groups. It helps folks in philanthropy and advancement think about ways and develop strategies that we can create race equity cultures within our organizations. And race equity, what does that mean? So taking what is traditionally white dominant cultures, spaces, organizations, and just reimagining what that system, what that structure, what that organization might look like if every present race, ethnic background, every intersection has access, has power, has some sort of some sort of leadership, access, and equity within that space, within that organization. And I think all of those pieces are important. The climate, the culture, the recruitment, the retention of those professionals. It's extremely important to set that foundation first as we consider ways that we bear out and produce and execute our programming. If we don't get the foundation right, it's going to show up in the ways in which we produce our engagement opportunities for alumni. And of note, I think leaders, we should know our alumni, our constituents, they are talking to each other about the ways that we show up, the practices that we have internally, our diversity and inclusion practices, the makeup of our teams and our leadership. They are examining that, they are observing that, because I think that's a notice to them how serious we are about inclusion, diversity, and representation of BIPOC communities. So that's the lens and take that I'll have today.
Thank you, Edward. And speaking about authenticity, again, a theme for this conversation, hopefully a theme we bring to any of our engagement work, no matter the audience. But authenticity has so much to do with language, I think, and that really brings us to our next question. I hope everyone was listening to our panel closely here. There are also a lot of resources and links in the chat related to our first question. And I want to encourage you to please put in your questions into the Q&A, which we will get to in about 10 or 15 minutes. So here, practically speaking, let's talk a little bit about language. The national and social justice movement, racial justice movement of the last few months, many months, has brought some new language to the fore. That's really important. Some terminology that has now made it to the national stage. And Meghan, you write this great blog, and let me get the title right. It's called "How Do You Say That?" It has been a wonderful thing for me to read. Tell us what we need to know about the importance of language in the way that we address and work with diverse populations.
Thank you, Jay. I just want to give recognition and gratitude to the many women in nonprofit and higher education who have helped me build that blog. You know who you are. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. I'd like to answer this question just sharing a quote by Paulo Freire that language is never neutral. I believe in its power. It can destroy and create worlds. So what we say and how we say it really matters, especially to alumni of color. Language evolves. It's one of the best, most human parts of our work. And it's our responsibility as practitioners to know what to say and to ask questions when you're unsure. And I think a lot of us in DEI work immediately write someone off when someone uses an outdated phrase, which I truthfully struggle with as well, but I'm trying to be better and more empathetic about that. But I believe it's my role as an advocate to help others learn new language. And there's a way to do this without pandering to white supremacy or making excuses for hurtful language. And that's why I started How Do You Say That? For that exact reason, because I believe in small acts of social justice, like using inclusive language that builds into a larger system of equity. And I can honestly say, terms like anti-racist or BIPOC even, that wasn't in my vernacular 3 years ago, but again, language evolves. And if I change my language just a tiny bit to make someone feel seen or appreciated, that's really not a lot that's being asked of us to do. As a woman of color, when I interact with folks using specific language, it's kind of code for me to be like, oh, I can trust this person, I'm safe. And I hope the language that we use with alumni of color, in marketing and how we phrase emails and how we do solicitations, I hope that gives them the same sense of safety and community that I frankly never got from my alma mater.
Well, thank you, Meghan, for being so vulnerable and sharing that with us. I know that, alumni is about belonging. That is what it's about. And there are many in our alumni communities who belong, who are entitled to belong, but don't feel that they do. They don't feel welcome. And I think language is a big part of that. And I love what you said, Meghan, that language is never neutral. That's certainly true. Edward, what's your perspective on this idea of language and how we use language with these diverse communities?
Yeah, I echo Meghan's thought there. It's extremely important that we are aware of the importance of language. And, I agree, we don't always get it right. And I honestly think that that's sometimes a barrier to advancing the work of pursuing racial equity is that fear of getting it wrong. So I referred earlier to Equity in the Center. They've got a fantastic model that helps, I think, leaders within organizations think about how we can, start from the beginning parts of our work and move all the way to a point that we are examining our systems and our climate, et cetera. And it's the awake to woke to work. That's a mouthful. Awake to woke to work. And so these three different phases look at, kind of the beginning phases. I think this goes back to Meghan's point. We don't know the language. We can't get it right all the times, but that's where we're at least examining what we need to do to get better, where we provide some kind of training and education for folks in our organizations about the language, pronouns, et cetera. Moving to woke, right? That's kind of the place where now we're examining the culture, our behaviors, the shared values within our organizations. And then we move to work, right? That's the sustainable point, that now we are looking at the climate and the systems, and we've learned the language. We've got these continuing educations and trainings that help us build confidence so that we can move towards equitable practices in our organizations. And I think it's extremely important that we consider all of that, all of those different phases without fear of getting it wrong, right? Just knowing that as we continue to develop those skill sets, we can get to a point where we build that equity within our organizations.
That's very well said, Edward. And we really hope that some of the conversation so far today for you, our attendees and folks watching, that this is putting some of that fear aside and giving you the resources and language you need to do this work, because it is not easy work, but it is important and it is our work. I think that's one of our themes for today as well. AP, how about your perspective on language and how this functions or doesn't function well in the alumni engagement space?
For sure. So to just echo the sentiments that both my colleagues already talked about, I'm going to talk about it more from a very practical and work perspective. For me, it's really allowing the volunteers and or that alumni group to be involved in the communication process. So what does that look like? That means actually bringing them in and allowing them to hopefully either coming up with the content or the copy of that content, and then getting that reviewed by our content and copy creators within the Alumni Association or the university. That also then allows some initial buy-in and some trust that not only the university, but the alumni group it's a symbiotic really relationship, because they're going to be able to know how the people within that community are going to be able to understand the messaging, but also you're getting the full breadth of what that communication style will look like, which may be different than what we are used to. I think also to Edward's point, some of that can also be done when the workforce looks a little bit more diverse. And I think we'll talk about that in a larger space. If the composition of the workforce or your organization is very homogeneous, then it's sometimes hard to get differing or diverse communication styles out if you're only used to how it goes for this one particular manner. And so in terms of why it's important, if we're able to change that radio, I like the radio station analogy. If we're able to change the station so that way other people can hear, then they might be more inclined to actually receive the information that we want to give to them.
Thank you, AP. Another great metaphor for our work, changing the station. I love that. Well, I hope everyone was listening closely to those responses, those great nuggets in there. Sometimes, as we said, language can be scary, but that's okay. Great points all around about how language and approach can really, truly change the game for us. So let's talk about practice. So in practice, at some level, many of us are working on or beginning to design specific strategies to engage alumni of color. How should an alumni relations office approach co-creating and working with diverse alumni groups, especially if we find little diversity within our own staff and office? Chase, I'm going to turn this one first to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm taking notes right now too, because these folks are always awesome. I think again, it's important to recognize like I'm a white, straight, cis male who has historically benefited from all of the things that advancement does and from opportunities. And again, I take that as something to be aware of, not as like a shield, not as a guilt trip, but just something to be aware of in this space because I am what a typical advancement shop officer or staff member often looks like in the field, and that's true. And so guilt is a wasted emotion, so it's more about thinking about what have folks written about, particularly scholars of color, to help me think about how I understand my own identities in this work. And part of that is looking at it from a critical lens. So there's so many critical race, scholars starting from Kimberly Crenshaw and on to think about how I exist in a space. And so immediately people take me more seriously. They don't interrupt me in meetings. They assume that I'm going to be an engaged alum because I go to this event or something like that. And so I really have to think about, when I think about my work, is how are those identities showing up in space? And again, I epically fail at this all the time. I was working in alumni relations and I come from that world. And I was working with someone who was leading social justice work. And I took up space that I did not mean to, but I did just purely because of my own ways of understanding organizational culture and outcomes. And I'm like, I have a goal. We want to hold this many events. And I love social justice work. I'm so passionate about this. And I ended up treating it as an outcome versus truly thought partnering with this individual who was leading so much impactful social justice work. And so it took me taking a second to slow down. And I even looked back at my emails and was like, what could I learn from this? And it was really a humbling experience, but it made me realize like it's not just an objective. It has to truly be ingrained into the work that you're looking at. And that's what so many scholars talk about, is that it can't be tokenizing. It can't be one-off. It can't be a bullet point on a strategy. It has to instead start with just really honest conversations about race. And it's okay to talk about race. People know that they are white or Black or indigenous or whatever identity that they identify with. And so it's really saying like, have we messed up in the past? What does it look like, the history of our institution? What are the privileges that our staff members come with? And really starting from a ground level conversational point to say, what can we do better? And so like, for instance, my alma mater has a Social Justice Institute for Black 14, who was a very critical point in history for race on the institution. But now, as they look back to that history and think about looking forward, they've really looked at, okay, how do we think this through from a BIPOC lens and work in partnership, not just say, we're going to do this, we're going to raise a scholarship and we've got this. And so it isn't a checkbox, it's a lived way of life that has to become lived and breathed and explored from a personal level of how am I showing up in a space, all the way to a systems level of, are we actually setting up systems and structures to support these folks and increase a sense of belonging? Or are we just giving lip service, like Edward said, which is the perfect thing to think about. So.
Thank you, Chase. The strategies that a lot of our attendees, I think, are looking for, asking about in the questions in the chat are sort of, how do I get started, or how do I restart a programmatic approach to engaging alumni of color? Edward, do you have some thoughts you could share on that?
Yes, absolutely. I think, again, speaking from the lens of what leaders are thinking about and what we as practitioners are thinking about, I really think that it's important to get our organization right. And what I mean by that is making sure we have the diverse makeup, the inclusive culture that we're talking about, in our programming. If that's what we're telling our external audiences that we espouse as a hallmark and something that we're serious about, it has to show up in our teams. And I think that we have to be intentional about cultivating that culture. I think we have to be thoughtful about our recruitment practices. There are too many resources out there in the field where there are exceptional pools of diverse talent. to bring into our organizations. I could give you a laundry list. I'll type that in the chat, but shout out to one of them that I'm a member of, the African American Development Officers Network. And there are so many others where the talent exists, but also they can provide our organizations with best practices in the field in terms of how we engage the various diverse audiences within our organizations. I think we also have to, if we're talking about race equity, we also have to examine some of the more traditional HR practices. So the interviewing process, what does that look like? What are our questions look like? Who's on our search committees? Pay and compensation, is that equitable across the board for all races? When we look at our promotion practices, does everyone have access to move into leadership positions? And all of that, I think, is extremely important for us to get right before we can execute effective and authentic engagement programming.
Edward, you're right on. I think that HR component is often overlooked or tokenized, and it just needs to be turned upside down in many cases. Thank you for that. AP, round us out here with this question about strategies for how we start or retool programs with alumni of color.
For sure, thank you. And so this is what I do on a daily basis. This is the work that I've been in for the last 2.5 years at the University of Oregon, and really what my job is around. And so specifically, I think having, to Everett's point, the diversity piece from an HR perspective, and then with Chase looking at what we are doing inwardly, but having a plan and then being committed to what that plan is, and then having not only a strategy, but what do we want to get out of the groups? And I think that is an area that we are still trying to determine is this group really here for the engagement, just to get together, to network, to be with students, or are there other opportunities that are gonna go longer than that? And so when I look at what the work that I do and really what we're all doing in this space, if you're in the alumni engagement space, you are at the very beginning of the pipeline. And the goal is to hopefully move someone from this engagement piece to the very end and get them to become a philanthropic donor. How we do that is hopefully through these affinity groups. And some of them you may call them affinity groups, or you might call them alumni of color groups. But the work that we're doing and how we engage those folks is paramount to if they're even going to become donors. And we have to really be focused on that engagement piece. And so how do we find that with our own diversity within ourselves is making sure that we reflect not only what we're saying we're committed to, as Edward said, from a organizational standpoint, but what it looks like for the groups themselves. So do we have a group that represents each of these different alumni constituencies? And then how do they want to work in themselves? And then ultimately they're connected to the students, because the student piece is how you get to grow the alumni piece. If they don't finish through and become alumni, the work that we're doing at the end, or for us is at the beginning, it's kind of becomes a moot point. And so I have a really vested interest in making sure that there is a tie-in from the affinity groups, that we are doing something back with the student population groups. And so that's really the direct tie-in that I will talk about, because I know we have to get to some of these questions, so I will leave it there. But if there's other questions that you want to ask specifically about how getting these groups off the ground, whether that's framework or documentation, feel free to send me an email.
Thank you, AP. And we will be sharing our emails at the end of this webinar and in a follow-up thank you email to all of you. So let's get to those burning audience questions. We've been tracking about 36 coming through the chat and through the Q&A. Meghan, I'm going to come to you with this very first question because I think you're the expert here. Someone has asked at a recent alumni board meeting, alumni board members from traditionally underrepresented or minoritized groups objected to the term alumni of color. And what am I supposed to do with that? That's the question.
That's a great question. I think there's also another question that I saw related to this about how alumni of color is a specific US term that's not applicable in an international lens. So to your board, I would just encourage you to establish that you are a paid staff professional here to find a solution and you're not putting the problem to be solved on minoritized communities, but B, related to kind of our last question of the importance of co-creation, ask your board what term would make them feel comfortable and inclusive of how that's represented. We can't generalize language with anything. What works at DU doesn't work at Auburn, doesn't work at Oregon. What works at DU for the Indigenous group doesn't work for our Asian Alumni Affinity group. It has to be specific to those communities. So again, that importance of building authentic relationships and having those conversations of just asking, how should we phrase this? Let's work together and figure that out.
Thank you, Megan. I knew you'd have the answer. Edward, I'm going to come to you with this next one. It's top of mind for a lot of us in a virtual space, mentoring. So the question is about how can mentoring play a role in supporting alumni communities of color, connecting to students of color, and how have you seen that work, or what advice do you have about how to approach mentoring in this space?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's extremely difficult in a virtual environment. But I think there are some ways that we can actualize that. So I would say from a leadership perspective, so those folks who are leaders in your organization, as you have employees of color in your organizations, I think it's just as simple as being intentional about having conversations about race and equity in your organizations. And I think overcoming that fear, I think you have to be intentional about building those relationships. I keep talking about fear, but I think that is an important barrier that prohibits us from achieving our goals. Is, race has always been pointed as an impolite conversation to have over dinner, right? We avoid it at all costs, but I think that's how we have gotten into the predicament that we are in now, because we don't talk about it, we don't face it head on. So if you aspire to have an authentic mentorship relationship within your organizations, leader to employees, you have to be vulnerable. You have to listen. You have to create psychological safety within your organizations as well is extremely important. So people feel comfortable enough, they feel safe to have these conversations about race, equity, et cetera, without fear of retribution, right? Without fear of being ostracized from those promotion opportunities. And it shows up if you're a leader and you espouse those and you act, you show that in your actions. We can see that as people on the teams. I think if you're thinking about students and alumni communities, take that same principle and apply it there as well. With your affinity groups, right? Have conversations about race, right? And I think also, as a mentor, encourage them to be participatory in the planning process and the execution process. I think having that buy-in and that engagement and accountability kind of helps develop those leaders. It helps them feel a part of the process, and you, I think, can strengthen your mentor relationship in that way through a number of virtual mechanisms. So,
thank you, Edward. I think intentionality, authenticity, these are all themes for our discussion today. Chase, I'm going to come to you with this next question, which I find fascinating. It's a question from an attendee who works at an HBCU, who is asking about, how do I engage alumni who do not identify as African American or Black, or important members of the community that support the institution? It's a heavy lift on this question, Chase, but any thoughts you have initially? I find it fascinating.
Yeah, and this would be, I just want to make sure that I'm honoring the question. So this would be like alumni who might not identify as Black or African American, but they're connected in affinity to some way. Is that right? Perfect. Yeah. And this is a really good question, because it's like we're almost flipping the script of, what we've got. And first, I want to point out that there is research on kind of what HBCU philanthropy has looked like. And there's so much phenomenal work being done by Nelson and Bowman and Dresner. So there is some awesome resources, but I think this is one that comes back to my work that I'm doing at the University of Denver, which is around community building and values exploration. And we all know how important community is, or else we wouldn't be in advancement, because all of our work simply does rely on this idea of community. But I think it's being intentional about what your mission is and what your core values are. So at an HBCU, that looks differently than a predominantly white institution or a Hispanic serving institution or any other institutions like that. And so if we go back to what is the core mission that we're trying to do, whether it's elevating and amplifying Black experiences or those who identify as African American, thinking about what does our funding strategy look like? Like, are we supporting our students? Do they understand that maybe even if they identify as something that is not Black, that maybe this space isn't for them, and that's okay to be talking about these conversations, and that race is very centered at an HBCU. And so I always lean on what are the values of the institution. And so if the values are inclusiveness, what does that look like through an HBCU lens that might be focused more on serving its Black and African American students? And so I think it's kind of flipping the script of, if we're going to think about what this looks like at a predominantly white institution, then we can kind of flip it and say, we want to engage with you, but we also do have a specific mission and a specific goal. And do you want to help us amplify those experiences and elevate folks and use philanthropy for justice? And I think that's how you could talk that through with them in a way to gain affinity that's about race, but it's a little bit more tailored to that specific individual who might not identify with that specific race.
Chase, thank you for taking on that question. I think another theme that we've heard today, not to homogenize people into buckets based on our understanding of who they are, but to simply ask and inquire and do that honestly. AP, our final question coming to you. So another one, I think, speaking to your strength and background, a lot of folks joining us today from smaller schools, smaller institutions, who are wondering, where do I put my resources first? What is going to matter most as I think about trying to design programs for Black, Indigenous, and people of color in the alumni communities? What do you think?
Thank you. And before I start, I just want to also, I did not say where I went to school at. So although Chase answered that question very eloquently, I appreciate it. I am a HBCU grad. I went to Clark Atlanta University. So I appreciate Chase for taking on that question. In regard to where you should start, this whole talk started back with research. And so I will bring it back to the data piece. If your data is not a important or an imperative part of your organization, you are not going to be able to effectively talk and engage with the alumni that you want to talk to. That is just as frank as I can be. And so I would personally be investing my resources into ensuring that we have up-to-date and accurate data. And then once as we're starting that process, look at some of the groups that already have large numbers, and you can start to look at different alumni that you can connect with that are, and I won't say pillars, but that are able to be great connectors for you to get that group started. I will say that prior to coming to Oregon, when I worked for another university, a lot of the work that I did was in understanding how the database works. And that understanding then gave me a good basis for when we're talking about how we engage our alumni constituency groups. Well, how many of those people do we have in that particular group? And then from that group, how do we make sure that we are connecting with the right individuals that will then connect us to those, even if we don't have them already coded or we've been talking to them. And so I think the data piece is first, and then when in terms of actually getting it off the ground and doing the work, is finding a key number, and I would say between 7 to 11 of individuals who are going to be committed to starting the group from beginning until you get it started. So I would say we have about a 2-year period of commitment, and then slowly but surely starting to build out programming that not only engages the alumni, but also, again, how does that tie back to campus and those students that are coming after. And so I will leave it there so that way we have opportunity to get to our to the other questions.
Thank you, AP. Well, those were tremendous audience questions, and thank you to our panelists for your willingness to be put on the spot like that. I'm so very impressed that each of you had a plan or a list or a strategy to share in response to these on-the-spot questions. So before we wrap up, I've invited some of our speakers from our very first Alumni Community of Practice coffee chat back on April 9th of this year, when we all thought we were going to be through it by now. So to my colleagues here, in 1 minute or less, our question for you is, what's changed and what's next in alumni relations? So Nancy, I'll turn to you first. How are things going at Pitt?
Thanks, Jay, and thanks for having me here. Thank you to our panelists. Great information. One thing I wanted to share as fodder for folks to think about is, and tied to some things that have already been shared, but it's to be brave. You know, I think, Edward, you said fear of getting it wrong prevents us from moving forward. And so it's, I'm sure a lot of people on this call, especially those that work for historically white institutions, the past few months when you've tried to design programming around diversity, equity, justice, you probably got some nasty grams from other alums. And so, you know, they say every action has an equal and opposite reaction. I think that's in physics and life in general. The story I'll relate is, you know, we put out a message to all of our alumni in support of, in particular, our Black community here. And of course, got some of those nasty grams back. And normally, what's changed with how I approach my work now versus even a year ago is normally I would just ignore those. I would think those people are a lost cause, it's fine, delete. But I actually was very selective in replying to some of those. Very, you know, matter of fact, unemotional, inviting them to further dialogue. And what I found out later is that one gentleman in particular decided to forward my email to all of his fraternity brothers and encourage them to harass me. But the good news is some of those fraternity brothers, well, first of all, they let me know because otherwise I wouldn't have known. But they responded to this particular alumnus and told him that he needs to rethink his approach to this. And so, like, realistically, do I think me, Nancy Merritt, as Vice Chancellor of Alumni Relations, am I going to change someone's mind just by an email? No. But these other people also kind of reiterating this, you know, some of these issues that could actually change his mind. So, so what I want to share is be brave. We have to, you know, chip away at this to really foster a diverse and equitable community. So thanks.
Thank you, Nancy. Be brave, and thanks for sharing that great story. Sometimes there's a lot of goodness in people that we can rely on. Chris, let me turn to you. What's changed? What's next? As a consultant, you're seeing a lot of things that maybe we don't see at the highest level.
Yeah. Thanks, Jay. Thanks for having me part. I love being part of the series. I'm going to build off of what Nancy said. Not surprising that we're on the same page on this. There's an old saying that goes, "Culture eats strategy for breakfast." You've all heard that, right? And I'll give you an example that I'm hearing. Whether you have, if you have the greatest of intentions or strategies, you'll be up against an institutional culture that has existed for years, decades, in some cases, centuries. And where you may have thought that a message that would go out to the community would have no impact, or if we surveyed people on this webinar, they'd all say, "Yep, that sounds good, send it out." Right? Most alumni, frankly, would respond and say, "You know, sounds good, send it out." But the reality is, you have alumni out there who are going to respond the way Nancy just described. And I have 3 clients that I learned about over the last month, week, and day. Literally yesterday, I heard the last time of this story, and there was 3 presidents who sent out messages to the entire alumni community, sort of promoting an agenda of anti-racism and equity, justice, etc., And the push, the response back was very strong and powerful in favor, but there was enough back that was completely negative, as Nancy, the nasty grams, as Nancy was describing, that it took the staff by surprise. It shocked many people that they have alumni out there that felt this way. And that's the culture coming back that's existed forever. So while Nancy said be brave, I'll add be aware. You're going to have that likely at your institution as well, and be ready for it. You can't be shocked by that response. You need to be ready and have a response system in place to deal with those kinds of things. And I've seen enough of them that at small and large institutions that we need to be ready for that. Thanks, Jay.
Thank you, Chris. And I think that's important, not to be shocked by the nasty grams we get, but to continue to be shocked and upset and angry about the tragedies that have brought us to this moment.
Yeah.
You know, that is what we need to continue to express rage about, a great emotion, rage. Finally, Julie, so what has changed and what's next in alumni relations from your perspective?
Oh, thank you so much, Jay. And I want to really thank you for bringing this conversation together today, and hope it's the first of several, because there's so many great follow-up opportunities for us. And Edward, I'm going to go back to something that you said, and I've gotten nuggets from each of you, so thank you. But one of the things that you said that really has stayed with me is it's how we show up. And I think what we've affirmed in this conversation this morning is also the opportunity for how we as alumni professionals can show up to lead. Because of the work that we do in the spaces that we create. And I think that's not only for our alumni, but also going back to conversations around our colleagues throughout our institutions, both our internal and our external audiences, and how we communicate and how we create space, particularly now for people to come together and really, create not only safe spaces, but spaces for people to have honest conversations with each other and to talk through all the various issues that are going on with all the things that we are facing and how we network and how we program. And I really do believe, Jay, that nobody does that better in higher education than alumni professionals. So let's look for opportunities to lead this work together. We're not always the first people and then the folks that we'll call upon, but talking about presidents who craft those messages, who knows better how to speak to the constituent group than we do. So let's look for spaces that we can lead this work and continue the incredible sharing that started this morning. And thank you for that, Jay.
Well, thank you to Julie and Nancy and Chris for coming back to join us and offering a perspective now 7 months later from our very first conversation. And thank you, Edward, AP, Chase, and Meghan as well. That's some rapid fire knowledge, and we are deeply appreciative of your honesty and vulnerability in responding to some really pointed questions. And I want to agree with what Julie just said, that this is where our industry shines, and that is what our little project is all about. So our alumni engagement community of practice started back in April, when I, along with some other chief alumni officers across the country, thought we need a forum for some real and honest conversation about how to address this pandemic and later the anti-racist and anti-Black, all of these different social justice movements. It's all materialized so quickly, and we needed a forum where we could connect with each other. And our motto is thought leadership without gurus. We are about lifting up voices from within our community to have honest conversations. You can view all of our webinars on demand and subscribe to this community at Linktree/alumni community. That's what the little website looks like. Here are some of the wonderful folks that have joined us in past conversations. We'd also enjoy staying in touch with you directly. Here are our email addresses. They will also be sent to you in a thank you note after this live session and also included in the recording. So our contact information is now on the screen. We would love to stay in touch with you. Now, stay healthy, happy, do what you can to support one another, and thank you again for joining us. Take care and bye-bye.